in the quiet corridors of power, in the marble halls where decisions shape the fate of nations, there exists a pattern that historians whisper about but few dare to name aloud. It is a pattern that has repeated itself with mechanical precision across 5 centuries, claiming every empire that believed itself invincible, every superpower that thought the rules of history would bend to its exceptional nature. This pattern does not announce itself with fanfare. It does not arrive as a sudden catastrophe. Instead, it unfolds in stages, each one following the last with the inevitability of a Greek tragedy. And by the time the final act begins, reversal is no longer possible. Consider 3 empires separated by centuries, yet bound by an identical fate. Spain in the golden age of the 16th century, when silver flowed from the Americas in quantities beyond imagination, and the Spanish crown-controlled territories spanning the globe. Britain in the early 20th century, when the sun never set on an empire that governed a quarter of humanity, and the pound sterling was the undisputed currency of international trade. The Soviet Union in the decades after the Second World War, when it stood as one of 2 superpowers capable of destroying civilization itself, commanding half of Europe and projecting influence across continents. 3 empires, 3 absolute collapses, and between them a sequence of 7 stages that played out with such consistency that one might mistake it for natural law. The pattern begins not with weakness, but with strength carried too far. Military overextension marks the first stage, the moment when an empire's reach begins to exceed its grasp in ways that are not immediately apparent. Spain understood this in the late 16th century, though understanding came too late. Under Philip II, Spanish military commitments sprawled across an impossible geography. Troops fought in the Netherlands to suppress Protestant rebellion, a conflict that would drain the treasury for 80 years. Armies occupied territories in Italy. Fleets patrolled the Mediterranean against Ottoman expansion. Garrisons manned fortifications in the Americas. And in 1588, Spain launched the Great Armada against England, a military adventure that cost a fortune and achieved nothing. Each commitment seemed justified in isolation. Each required resources, and together they created a military budget that consumed the empire's wealth faster than silver mines could replenish it. Britain followed the same trajectory 3 centuries later, though the mechanisms differed in detail while remaining identical in essence. The First World War transformed Britain from the world's largest creditor nation into a debtor. The Second World War completed the process. Between 1914 and 1945, Britain maintained military commitments that spanned the entire globe. Troops fought in France, in North Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East. The Royal Navy patrolled every ocean. Bomber Command reduced German cities to rubble at staggering cost. Each commitment seemed necessary, each required resources. And when peace arrived in 1945, Britain discovered that victory had bankrupted the victor. The empire still existed on maps, but the economic foundation that sustained it had been consumed by 30 years of total war. The Soviet Union entered military overextension through a different door but arrived at the same destination. After 1945, the USSR maintained the largest standing army on Earth. It occupied Eastern Europe with hundreds of thousands of troops. It supported communist movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It engaged in a nuclear arms race that diverted vast resources into weapons systems. And in 1979, it invaded Afghanistan, a conflict that would bleed the Soviet military for a decade while producing nothing but casualties and expense. The pattern held. Military commitments expanded until they exceeded the capacity of the economy to sustain them, and the foundation began to crack. Military overextension creates the conditions for the second stage: currency debasement. When an empire can no longer fund its commitments through taxation alone, it turns to the printing press, and the value of money begins its long decline. Spain provides the purest example. Between 1550 and 1650, Spanish ships transported an estimated 16,000 tons of silver from the Americas to Europe. This wealth should have made Spain invincible. Instead, it triggered a monetary catastrophe that economists still study. The Spanish crown spent the silver faster than it arrived. Wars consumed entire fleets' worth of bullion. Court extravagance swallowed fortunes. And when silver proved insufficient, the crown debased the copper coinage, reducing precious metal content while maintaining face value. Prices in Spain increased by more than 400% between 1550 and 1650. The silver that should have secured Spanish dominance instead destroyed the domestic economy through inflation that made Spanish goods uncompetitive and Spanish workers impoverished. Britain's currency debasement took a more subtle form, wrapped in the technical language of modern finance. During the First World War, Britain abandoned the gold standard, allowing the pound to float and the government to print money to finance the war effort. The pound lost a third of its value against the dollar by 1920. Britain returned to gold in 1925 at the pre-war parity, a decision that proved catastrophic. The economy contracted, unemployment soared. And when the Second World War arrived, Britain again abandoned gold and again printed money to fund military operations. By 1949, the pound had been devalued from $4.03 to $2.80. The currency that had once been the bedrock of international trade was losing value in measured steps, each devaluation smaller than the crisis it was meant to address, each one moving Britain closer to the next stage of the pattern. The Soviet Union's currency debasement happened behind closed doors, in a command economy where market signals were suppressed, but economic reality could not be eliminated. The ruble existed as both an internal currency and a propaganda tool. Official exchange rates bore no relationship to purchasing power. The state printed rubles to fund military spending and industrial projects, creating money without creating corresponding value. Soviet citizens understood the reality. They hoarded goods rather than holding rubles. They traded in dollars and German marks when they could. And by the 1980s, the gap between official monetary policy and economic reality had grown so vast that the currency existed as a fiction maintained by force. The debasement was complete, even if it was never formally acknowledged. Currency debasement accelerates the arrival of the third stage, the debt spiral. This is the point at which borrowing begins to feed on itself, where debt is issued not to fund productive investment, but to service existing obligations, and where the mathematics of compound interest start to overwhelm the arithmetic of economic growth. Spain entered the debt spiral in the late 16th century with a financial innovation that seemed brilliant at the time. The crown issued bonds called juros, promising to pay interest from tax revenues. Initially, these bonds funded specific projects. But as military spending escalated and silver inflation eroded tax revenues, the crown issued more juros to pay interest on existing juros. By 1600, more than half of all crown revenues went to servicing debt. Philip II defaulted on Spanish debts in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. Each default provided temporary relief. Each one destroyed trust, and each one made future borrowing more expensive, accelerating the spiral. Britain's debt spiral began in earnest during the First World War. In 1914, British national debt stood at around £700 million. By 1919, it had exploded to £7.4 billion, more than tenfold increase in 5 years. The ratio of debt to gross domestic product reached 130%. Interest payments consumed a quarter of government revenues. Britain spent the 1920s and 30s trying to manage this burden through austerity and taxation, but the Second World War shattered any hope of escape. By 1945, British debt to GDP exceeded 250%. The government was borrowing to pay interest on money borrowed to fight wars that had ended. The spiral was complete, and the options for escape had narrowed to inflation or default. The Soviet Union's debt spiral manifested differently in an economy without market pricing, but the underlying dynamic remained identical. The USSR borrowed from Western banks during the détente period of the 1970s, using the loans to import grain and technology. These loans were meant to boost productivity and generate returns that would exceed the borrowing costs. Instead, the loans funded consumption and covered the gaps in a failing system. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was borrowing to pay for imports that its own economy could no longer produce. The oil price collapse of 1986 removed the one source of hard currency that kept the system functioning. And when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, he inherited an empire where economic productivity could no longer keep pace with debt obligations, military spending, and the costs of maintaining control over satellite states. The fourth stage arrives when the debt spiral begins to destroy the underlying productive capacity of the economy. This is the moment when resources that should flow into innovation, infrastructure, and capital formation are instead consumed by interest payments, military budgets, and efforts to manage decline. Spain experienced this as de-industrialization. The flood of American silver made Spanish labor expensive and Spanish manufacturing uncompetitive. Cheaper goods flowed in from the Netherlands, from France, from anywhere production costs were lower. Spanish artisans found themselves unable to compete. Workshops closed, skills disappeared, and the Spanish economy became dependent on imported manufactures paid for with silver that was itself running out as mine yields declined. By 1650, Spain had transformed from a producer of goods into a consumer sustained by depleting resources, and when the silver stopped flowing, the economy collapsed into poverty from which it would not recover for centuries. Britain's loss of productive capacity unfolded across the 20th century, as industries that had once led the world fell behind competitors who learned from British innovations and improved upon them. British steel production peaked before the First World War. British textile manufacturing began its long decline in the 1920s. British shipbuilding lost market share to Japan and Korea. And by the 1970s, Britain was experiencing de-industrialization on a scale not seen since the Industrial Revolution itself. Factories closed, coal mines shut down, and the economy shifted away from making things toward financial services and consumption funded by selling assets accumulated during the imperial period. The productive base that had built the empire was dismantled piece by piece. The Soviet Union's loss of productive capacity happened despite massive investment in heavy industry, revealing a deeper truth about this stage of the pattern. It is not the absence of factories that marks the loss of productive capacity, but the inability of those factories to generate value that exceeds their costs. Soviet industry produced vast quantities of steel, but the steel was used inefficiently. It manufactured tractors, but the tractors broke down. It built power plants, but the power plants polluted and consumed resources without producing corresponding economic growth. The entire economic model was based on extensive growth, expanding inputs rather than improving outputs. And by the 1980s, this model had exhausted itself. Productivity stagnated, technology fell further behind the West, and the gap between what the Soviet economy produced and what Soviet citizens needed grew wider each year. The fifth stage is social decay, the point at which the economic stresses of the previous stages begin to fracture the social cohesion that holds an empire together. This stage is marked by rising inequality, collapsing trust in institutions, internal division, and the sense that the compact between state and citizen has been broken. Spain in the 17th century saw its population decline by nearly 2 million people between 1600 and 1650. Plague and emigration played roles, but so did economic hopelessness. The Spanish countryside emptied as peasants fled lands they could no longer work profitably. Madrid and other cities filled with unemployed vagrants. The minor nobility, the hidalgos, refused to engage in commerce because manual labor was beneath their dignity, so Spain developed a parasitic upper class that consumed without producing. Crime increased. Begging became widespread, and the social fabric that had sustained Spanish power during the 16th century unraveled into dysfunction. Britain's social decay manifested in the decades after the Second World War as the empire dissolved and British society struggled to define a new identity. The certainties of the Victorian age were gone. The empire that had given Britain purpose and wealth was collapsing. And British cities became sites of industrial strife, racial tension, and political polarization. The 1970s brought the winter of discontent, when strikes paralyzed the country and uncollected garbage piled in the streets. Trust in government collapsed. Class conflict intensified. And Britain seemed trapped in managed decline, unable to adapt to a world where it was no longer a first-rank power. The Soviet Union's social decay appeared in the form of cynicism, corruption, and the complete erosion of belief in the system. By the 1980s, Soviet citizens no longer believed the propaganda. They knew the economy was failing. They saw the nomenclature enriching itself while ordinary people stood in lines for basic goods. Alcoholism reached epidemic levels. Life expectancy began to decline. And when Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika, hoping to reform the system, he instead unleashed forces that tore it apart. Ethnic tensions that had been suppressed for decades erupted into violence. Republics demanded independence, and the social cohesion that force had maintained for 70 years disintegrated in months. The sixth stage is the loss of reserve currency status, the moment when the international community stops accepting an empire's money as the default medium of exchange. This stage is catastrophic because it eliminates the empire's ability to fund deficits by exporting inflation. Spain never had true reserve currency status in the modern sense. But Spanish silver served a similar function as the primary medium of international exchange. When the silver mines of Potosí and Zacatecas saw declining yields in the mid-17th century, Spain lost its monetary power. Without the ability to pay debts in silver, Spanish credit collapsed entirely. Britain lost reserve currency status in the decades after the Second World War through a process that combined policy decisions with inevitable decline. The 1949 devaluation signaled that the pound could no longer maintain its value. The 1956 Suez Crisis demonstrated that Britain could no longer act without American approval, and throughout the 1950s and 1960s, countries around the world shifted their reserves from pounds to dollars. The sterling area, the zone of countries that used pounds for trade and held reserves in London, gradually dissolved. By 1971, when the United States itself ended dollar convertibility to gold, the pound had long since ceased to be the world's reserve currency. The loss was complete, and with it went Britain's ability to finance consumption through monetary privilege. The Soviet Union never achieved reserve currency status, which in some ways made its collapse even more dramatic. The ruble was not trusted outside the Soviet bloc, so the USSR had to earn hard currency through exports to fund imports. When oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, Soviet hard currency earnings evaporated. The government could not borrow internationally because no one trusted Soviet credit. And without the ability to print money that others would accept, the Soviet Union faced a simple choice: reform the system or watch it collapse. Gorbachev chose reform, but the reforms destroyed the system faster than they could save it. The seventh and final stage is collapse itself, the moment when the accumulated stresses become too great and the structure fails. Spain's collapse happened gradually across the 17th century. The economy shrank, the population declined, the military suffered humiliating defeats. And by 1680, Spain had fallen from being the dominant European power to being a second-rank state dependent on French support. The collapse was not a single event, but a process of decline that left Spain impoverished and peripheral for 2 centuries. Britain's collapse happened faster, compressed into the decade following the Second World War. In 1945, Britain still governed the largest empire in history. By 1954, that empire was dissolving. India had gained independence in 1947, taking with it the jewel of the empire. Palestine was abandoned in 1948. The Suez Crisis of 1956 demonstrated that Britain could not act independently against American wishes. And over the next 15 years, colony after colony became independent. The collapse was managed, negotiated, done with as much dignity as circumstances allowed, but it was collapse nonetheless. Britain in 1970 was a middle power, no longer capable of projecting force globally, no longer central to the international system. The Soviet Union's collapse was the most dramatic because it was the most compressed. In 1985, the USSR was a superpower with thousands of nuclear weapons and control over half of Europe. By 1991, it had ceased to exist. The process took less than 7 years from the beginning of serious reform to total dissolution. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Eastern European satellites broke away. The Baltic states declared independence, and on December 26th, 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved into 15 independent republics. The collapse was so rapid that it seemed impossible even to those who witnessed it. 3 empires, 3 collapses, 1 pattern. And now we must ask the question that cannot be avoided. Where does the United States stand in this 7-stage sequence? The evidence suggests a position further along than most Americans would find comfortable. Military overextension is evident in commitments that span the globe. In an $800 billion annual defense budget, in deployments across dozens of countries, in wars that stretch across decades without victory or conclusion. Currency debasement appears in the expansion of the money supply, in deficit spending that has become permanent, in the understanding that the printing press is now the primary tool of economic management. The debt spiral is visible in a national debt exceeding $34 trillion, in annual deficits that exceed $1 trillion during economic expansions, in interest payments that now consume more than the defense budget. Loss of productive capacity shows itself in the decline of manufacturing, in dependence on foreign production for essential goods, in the transformation of the economy towards services and consumption funded by asset appreciation and debt. And social decay is apparent in rising inequality, in declining trust in institutions, in political polarization that has made governance nearly impossible, in life expectancy that has stalled or declined in communities, hollowed out by economic changes that concentrated wealth in fewer hands and fewer places. These are the first 5 stages. The United States has completed them all. The 6th stage, loss of reserve currency status, has not yet occurred, but the warning signs are accumulating. Countries are conducting trade in currencies other than the dollar. Central banks are diversifying reserves. The weaponization of dollar access through sanctions has taught potential adversaries to build systems that bypass American financial infrastructure. The 6th stage has not arrived, but it can be seen on the horizon. Does this mean the 7th stage is inevitable? History suggests that patterns this consistent across multiple empires and centuries have a momentum that is difficult to reverse. But history also shows that the timing varies. Spain's decline took 80 years, Britain's took 40, the Soviet Union's took less than a decade. The question is not whether the pattern applies, for the evidence suggests it already does. The question is whether understanding the pattern allows for intervention that might alter the sequence, whether knowledge of the stages provides the opportunity to choose a different path. That question remains unanswered, suspended between the weight of historical precedent and the possibility, however slim, that this time might be different. But the pattern is clear, the stages are defined, and the progression is visible to anyone willing to look without the comfort of exceptionalism. The next acts of this drama will determine whether understanding the pattern is enough to change it, or whether 5 centuries of history will add one more empire to the sequence of collapse.